Hello everyone, this is TobeTada with another video of crypto trading. Thanks for checking by, and let's dive right in. So today we'll talk about the FET USDT trading pair and how it relates to Bitcoin, and also we're going to have a look at its fractal and what we've been saying in some videos, I think some weeks ago, and how the prediction played out so far. So if you look at this movement here, it began trading on Binance at the end of February to right now. You can see that there was basically overall a loss of about 50%, and you can see that its movement is actually also governed by Bitcoin. You can see, for example, that I drew in two lines here, and this first line here was around the beginning of April, which corresponds to the spike here, and you can see that basically also from starting from there a little bit earlier, we saw this massive increase here, which would correspond to about this area here. So if we draw it in up here, it's easy to get fooled by the scale of this chart, because the increase here, it looks, if you look at it, it looks very small, but actually it's an increase of 13% here. So this was basically going upwards with Bitcoin here, although proportionally smaller, and then we had another corrections here, which correspond to here. So we had a loss of, again, about 13%, actually went lower the price here than where it, so to speak, started here when we just analyzed it, and that would correspond to this drop here. So basically this first correction going down here of about 8%, then we saw an increase again, which is basically this part here, and at April 11th, this was basically this second major, or this, in this case, not too major, but the second correction here of about 10%, and that was actually more pronounced here. It was about 20%. So you can see, although this chart looks quite different to the Bitcoin movement here, it's actually still corresponding quite well to Bitcoin. And since then we had actually now an increase of 40%, so that's quite significant here. It doesn't look like much, but it's basically this point here. So when we had 8% of Bitcoin increase, this second movement here, since we had this peak going upwards, we had actually in the FET USDT trading pair, we had a 44% increase here. And so that's, I want to show how it relates to Bitcoin, and that it does indeed correspond fairly well to its movement. At the beginning, I think the movement was somewhat opposite in the sense that when went upwards, that Bitcoin basically fell. You can also see that in some areas here, and I think I'll have to make another video about these two types of coins, that some altcoins go with Bitcoin, the majority, and some, however, have basically a counter movement. But as you can see, you can easily get fooled by the scale here. So if you look at it, break it down at the major movement in Bitcoin, you can basically see this is turning out pretty well with, for example, FET, the coin here. And so the second thing I want to talk about is actually the a very interesting analysis we did some weeks back, and that related to the fractal here that we can see in this coin, which basically looks something like that. So you can see we basically have a peak here and another smaller peak, and then basically the movement going since basically the start of the trade been seeing a downward movement here, but you can see at the end here they were basically reached a bottom, and now it looks like we're going back up again. And we looked at this in detail. Can do it again quickly. We can basically see this fractal very nicely here. You can see this peak and then the second peak. Or if we zoom out, we can see a peak and a second peak. That's another fractal. So depending on your chart and how you look at it, you can see these smaller and larger fractals and patterns. That's why they're actually called fractal, because at every level you can see the same kind of pattern or movement. And so I suggested some videos back that we'd see here basically the playing out of a larger fractal, which would look something like that. So you'd have the first peak here and basically a second peak here. And I believe I drew it in somewhere here or so, I'm not exactly sure, but basically you can't really, it's hard to predict where this will happen, but you can predict the basic pattern. And I think this is playing out quite nicely here, since we've had this low point here, the April 10th, going up now about 40% increase, so that's already pretty decisive here. And I think the way it looks like, we're basically having a peak and the second peak. And you can even look at this fractal if you just go and look at the latest movement here, which is basically a peak and another peak. Now we'll have to see what happens here, but that's basically the fractal again here. And I think perhaps we can, from smaller fractals like this, we can also see what the bigger fractal might hold, or what might happen. So if we have this larger peak at the beginning and then a second peak, perhaps the fractal will evolve into something like this here. So instead of having now a second peak and going down, we might actually have then an upward movement. So something like perhaps this, or perhaps we'll just have the second peak going straight up again. We'll have to see how that unfolds. For now, it was very clear that this was basically first peak and a second peak, but was quite lower. And perhaps now that we're going back to this more bullish movement here, this pattern might very well actually even turn into something like that here for the time being, before going back again. And perhaps we'll have basically this might switch around, that we have the first peak going being the smaller peak and the second peak being the larger peak. We'll have to see, but I think this was interesting to point out that we're basically having this increase here, and I suspect that this will continue depending on perhaps indications of these smaller individual fractals. We might, I'm suggesting a price range in the 0.3s, so somewhere around here. Perhaps it will actually, depending on how the price moves here, might have a correction or not, going back up into this area here. And this will probably still be some weeks in the future here. But for the mid to even short term, I would expect this price to go back up here in this range here. So have this fractal reoccurring. So let me know what you think, and see you in the next video. Bye.